Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Jenny. Thank you, Vera, for generously offering to act as respondent. I'm very much looking forward to your comments. We've been discussing this for a while now. And I'd also like to thank the whole team at CAPAS, all the core staff and all the research fellows who I've been working with since September 2022. So thank you in strictly alphabetical order. I hope I'm getting this right. Amin, Brad, Christian, Christine, Dwayne, Elke, Emily, Ekaterina, Eva, Felicitas, Hannah, Gregor, Jenny, Juliet, Laura, Marina, Laura, Marina, Max, Maya, Michael, Nina, Paolo, Patricia, Philip, Richard, Robert, Rolf, Simon, Teresa, Thomas, and Ute. It's been a real pleasure to be here this year. I learned a lot. I wish it would never end. Thank you very much. Even and perfect, the city lies amid green grass, sunny hills, and wooden mountains. The buildings, or rather the single uninterrupted building, consists of cubic cells, 5 cubits each way. Each cell has 2 external walls. The walls facing north are capable of emitting 3D images, sounds, and smells. Against the opposite wall, we find a seat capable of molding perfectly to the human body, even enclosing it completely. Incorporated in the seat is an apparatus for satisfying all physiological needs: alimentary, excretory, sexual. In each cell is an individual whose brain impulses are continually transmitted to an electronic analyzer set at the top of the building, beneath a continuous semi-cylindrical vault. The analyzer selects, compares, and interprets the desires of each individual, programming the life of the entire city moment by moment. All citizens are in a state of perfect equality. Death no longer exists. This comes from one of the most baffling works of Italian speculative fiction, Le 12 città ideali, premonizioni della parusia urbanistica, which translates into English as 12 ideal cities, premonitions of the second coming of urbanism. More specifically, I read to you the first half of 2,000-ton city, the description of a dystopian megastructure, narrated in the coldly precise language of modernist architectural planning. 2,000-ton city is a sprawling grid of cubic cells controlled by a single cybernetic feedback loop. Each cell is a space of atmospheric and social immunity, a perfectly engineered provider of nutrition and stimuli containing exactly one human individual. There are no biological limits to human lives in the city. Inhabitants can survive for centuries in a state of apparent contentment, but no adverse feelings or thoughts are tolerated. If a person shows even the slightest signs of boredom or dissatisfaction, the large machine will lower an enormous weight, 2,000 tons, of course, and crush them to death. This won't happen here, so feel free to show signs of boredom and dissatisfaction whenever you wish. The cell is then automatically disinfected, and an ovum and sperm from adjacent cells are used to create an embryo who will inherit the cell. Published in January 1972, in the architectural journal Casabella, 12 città is one of the most well-known works of the radical architecture collective Superstudio, whose 5 members are depicted here in a 1970 photograph by the group's co-founder Cristiano Toraldo di Francia, trying hard to look a bit like the Beatles, I think. And 12 città is an odd text. Individually, none of the 12 brief chapters are entirely original. 2,000-ton city, for example, offers a well-rehearsed trope of dystopian science fiction, fully automated, solitary life, which is at least as old as E.M. Foster's The Machine Stops of 1909. The fourth text in the series, Spaceship City, pokes fun at the cosmic optimism of 2001: A Space Odyssey and contains a description of a ring-shaped orbiting space colony, which is clearly similar to the spaceship in Stanley Kubrick's film. What makes 12 Città distinctive, in brief, is not its subject matter, but the author's peculiarly succinct narrative style, which appears entirely focused on descriptive detail and contains no plotted narrative. Moreover, Superstudio's dystopian urban futures are enhanced by visual collages. For example, the illustration of 2000-ton city, which you saw at the beginning, consists of an altar-like polyptych of 9 images. At the top, a large horizontal green and orange drawing shows an aerial view of seemingly pristine woods, meadows and hills, which are enclosed by an enormous grid of rectangular walls. Below, 8 smaller images include a schematic, I'll just show it to you again, a schematic drawing of the same rectangular grid, a photograph of human cells, a sketch of a female head with electrodes, and 2 sepia-tone photographs which show a human fetus and a girl's choir. Like a pictorial cabinet of curiosities, these images display, but also displace, contemporaneous fears about totalitarian power and social collapse. Superstudio's playful visual storytelling seems to conjure a sense of open-ended speculation, a kaleidoscopic game of creative possibilities across media, in apparent contrast with the apocalyptic fatalism of the short narratives. Superstudio, who became known, in the words of a New York Times article, as the collective that made history, but no buildings, was brought together by a shared fascination with anthropology, philosophy, and science fiction. Their earliest works were conceived in response to a devastating flood which hit their home city, Florence, in 1966, and which is often revisited in the group's collages of the early 70s. Italia Nostra of 1972, for example, mimics the glossy aesthetics of Technicolor postcards and shows some of Italy's most iconic tourist destinations variously transformed by apocalyptic interventions. In Venice, the Canal Grande has become a motorway. The historic center of Rome is buried in garbage and protected against environmental pollution by a vast air-conditioned dome. On Pisa's Campo dei Miracoli, cathedral and baptistry are thrown out of balance to match the city's famous leaning tower. Finally, Florence is completely flooded so that visitors can enjoy direct and easy access by boat to Brunelleschi's dome and Giotto's campanile. In 12 Città, the same caustically playful attention is turned to utopian glass and steel modernism and to the architectural megastructures of the 1960s. Works such as Buckminster Fuller's 62-meter-high translucent geodesic dome, built as the American Pavilion for the 1967 World Fair in Montreal, in Canada. Fuller, a maverick environmentalist, became famous in the late 1950s when he toured the world with 3 key messages. Humans must overcome nationalism and become citizens of the universe. His terms. They must learn to protect their unique, fragile planet, spaceship Earth. That's his terms again. They must protect their planet against nuclear catastrophe and environmental collapse. Finally, they must move away from violently antagonistic and resource-hungry ways of life and endorse communitarian, sustainable forms of social organization. Fuller, who had been kicked out of Harvard in 1927, gained wealth and notoriety when he patented the design of the geodesic dome, an architectural structure in which the surface of an abstract sphere is approximated by interlocking triangles. This would become both the trademark of Fuller's ecological activism and the financial basis for his travels. In 1959, for example, Fuller proposed the construction of a 3-kilometer geodesic dome over Manhattan, which would supposedly reduce the city's energy consumption by 80%. Meanwhile, Fuller's company, Synergetics, designed geodesic domes for industrial purposes and even sold them to the US military, who deployed them as efficient, transportable shelters. Despite these apparent contradictions, the geodesic dome came quickly known as the symbol of utopian world-making. In 1965, for example, a group of art students from the University of Kansas bought a field in rural Colorado where they established Drop City, a fully sustainable anti-authoritarian settlement of low-tech domes built with recycled scrap metal from wrecked cars. An archaic form and a highly sophisticated mathematical object, the dome appealed to techno-utopians and esoteric cosmologists alike. Dome-shaped structures abounded in the imaginary worlds of science fiction, while also providing inspiration for anti-establishment artists such as the Italian Mario Merz, who completed his earliest dome-shaped installation in 1968. Japp's Igloo, one of the most iconic works of Italian arte povera, is a metal structure covered with small earth-filled plastic bags and decorated with the Italian translation of a saying attributed to North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap: "If the enemy masses his forces, he loses ground. If he scatters, he loses force." So what do these projects have in common? In her 2015 monograph, Forms, literary scholar Caroline Levine has adopted the concept of affordance to describe the relation between aesthetic and social arrangements. In design theory, affordance is a term that describes the potential uses latent in materials and designs. For example, say cotton affords both fluffiness and breathable cloth, depending on how it's sort of spun into yarn and thread. Similarly, Levine's study examines cultural forms beyond theories of mimetic representation. Patterns and shapes, she explains, are both situated and portable. They remain surprisingly stable across different historical and cultural circumstances, but are always employed in response to specific conditions. For Levine, this relation between cultural form and social context can be described as a field of affordances. And I quote, "As they move, forms bring their limited range of affordances with them. No matter how different their historical and cultural circumstances, that is, bounded enclosures will always exclude, and rhyme will always repeat." End of quote. With this methodology in mind, we can now pose a new set of questions about the dome. Which political, social, and affective stances does it afford? How does it organize or disorganize the lives of those who are conditioned by it? What dispositions does it perpetuate? Which opportunities does it afford? Architectural historian Douglas Murphy traces the origins of the modernist biodome to the middle of the 19th century, when winter gardens, such as the Palm House at Kew Gardens in London or the Jardin d'Hiver in Paris, were celebrated as masterpieces of structural engineering. He writes, and I quote, "The greenhouse, and by extension the dome and the artificial biosphere, allow us to see the world in different ways, the natural world in different ways. These built environments hold living plants in a brightly lit, yet environmentally sealed enclosure with vast networks of pipes humidifying, warming, and cooling the building. In this way, they assert humanity's seemingly effortless dominance over the material world." End of quote. In other words, the biodome affords both atmospheric immunity and controlled mobility. Thank you, Jenny Stumer, for inspiring this idea. The greenhouse makes it possible to transport flora and fauna across the world, between continents, and to display it in locations where they would not normally survive. More than a century later, we encounter these same affordances in Silent Running, a 1972 environmental apocalyptic science fiction film directed by Douglas Trumbull. And I thank Christine Cornier for bringing this film to my attention. Here, all plant life on Earth has become extinct, but many specimens are preserved in enormous geodesic, in a whole series, in fact, of enormous geodesic domes. There are 6 of them, which are attached to a large cargo spaceship stationed outside the orbit of Saturn. Freeman Lowell, interpreted by Bruce Stern, is a resident botanist on one of these ships, where he maintains the plants with the help of small service robots. But things quickly go wrong, as they always do. Violent conflict ensues when the government orders Lowell to destroy the domes and return the freighter to commercial service. This is 1972, right? The government is bad. The botanist tries to resist. 5 of the 6 domes are detonated. Lowell manages to escape with the one remaining spaceship, and in the film's last notorious scene, this is the bit which anybody who watched the film will remember, Lowell cuts loose the last remaining greenhouse and destroys the fighter, the spaceship, and himself in the process, so that the plants can survive. We then see the well-lit geodesic dome. This is the model up there that they used, drift off into space with childlike service robot Dewey dutifully irrigating the plants with a battered pink watering can. Very, very cute, right? Trumbull's melancholy ending leaves no hope for social progress, collective resistance, and is in fact dominated by a dysphoric mood, which has become familiar in recent decades and which has found expression in the affective registers of solastalgia, ecological grief, and pre-trauma. In the final scene of Silent Running, fatalistic attitudes towards the future are expressed by the juxtaposition of 2 seemingly distinct, but in fact similarly atemporal or timeless spaces. The lifeless void of the outer galaxy and the bounded, static totality of the biodome, where time is only marked by the little robot's endlessly repetitive gestures. On Mario Merzi's dome-shaped igloo, the neon-lit words of revolutionary leader Vaux read like a Goldilocks theory of social organization. Don't scatter too much, don't contract too much, be just right. The bounded volume of the dome affords the same message. Inside, discordant energies and possibilities are forged into a single, static, ideological whole. Outside, diversity is constructed and excluded as external, inimical and threatening. Remember, it has the word il nemico, the enemy, written on top of the igloo. We can read this affordance of the dome shape via the social fantasy which my CAPAS co-fellows Robert Kirsch and Emily Ray have described as the bunkerizing subject. If you were here last semester, you heard them speak about this project. If not, watch it on YouTube, and you will see that there is a lot of similarities and, in fact, parallels between the preppers' dreams of post-apocalyptic self-management and, to quote my examples, the libertarian settlement of Drop City, or indeed Mario Merzi's 1968 fascination with anti-authoritarian protest. Instead of exploring these historical similarities, I wish to underline the centrality of bounded autonomy to European philosophies of subjectivity. a cultural tradition which philosopher Etienne Balibar has dated back to St. Augustine's demand that man must subject himself to himself. In his influential study of 2007, Provincializing Europe, historian Dipesh Chakrabarty offers a robust critique of Enlightenment-inspired conceptions of abstract, interchangeable, autonomous individuality, a framework which Chakrabarty notoriously described as simultaneously indispensable and inadequate for anti-imperial and post-colonial politics. Chakrabarty gives three main reasons for the inadequacy of liberal moral political theory. First, he claims that liberal moral political theory equates the historical emergence of Western modernity with teleological narratives of unilinear global progress. Secondly, according to Chakrabarty, this worldview presumes a single, homogeneous and secular historical time. Finally, he claims that the worldview cultivates a deliberate blindness to what he describes as affectively rich, anthropologically differentiated manifestations of subaltern life. A similar set of propositions has been formulated by anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli in one of her earliest monographs, The Empire of Love, published in 2006. Here, Povinelli focuses on the relation between what she calls the autological subject and the genealogical society. So discourses of fantasies of self-making, she contends, are constitutively dependent on practices of social constraint that are historically linked to colonial gestures of mastery. So this is a bit complex, but I hope to unpack it at the end of my lecture in the final part. First, let me return for a moment to Dodici Città. Written only 3 years after the completion of Japp's Igloo, 2,000-ton city seems light years away from the utopian optimism of the 1960s. Self-contained atmospheric immunity is here figured as a domain of absolute biopolitical control, the annihilation of subjectivity. And yet, Super Studio's dark tale of the complete erasure of individual will is perhaps more similar to Merz's euphoric celebration of heroic self-enclosure than might appear at first sight. As literary scholar Aaron Rosenfeld has explained, dystopian last man fiction, such as E.M. Foster's The Machine Stops or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, remember John the Savage, these are profoundly reactionary and nostalgic, according to Rosenfeld, because they conjure both a feeling of powerlessness and a wish in the reader to return to a state of individual liberty. Similarly, we could say that Super Studio's narrative of this vast cybernetic hive with its multitude of meaningless lives, equal lives, in fact evokes the meaningful absence of an autonomous, presumably male hero who is free to ingest, procreate, and excrete at his will, right? Eat, fuck, and shit. I always wanted to say this in a recorded lecture. The relation between fears of incarceration and recuperative fantasies of spherical self-enclosure is complex, perhaps paradoxical. Its nuances and cultural historical influences have been explored with extraordinary attention to breadth by philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. His consecutive volumes, Bubbles, Globes, and Foams have been read as confrontation with Heidegger's idea of philosophy as meditative dwelling, but they can also be understood as a critique of network theory. Indeed, the German philosopher seems allergic to any description of social form that overstates the significance of linear connections of points within a single planar surface. For Sloterdijk, in the beginning was the bubble. All cultural worlds are structured immunologically in the sense that each world interprets every difference within itself as a possible foreign invasion. Yet, all spaces of immunity are also, by necessity, spaces of community, a point that Sloterdijk makes in the first part of Bubbles through an extensive discussion of archetypal narratives of divine breath. God shares breath through the act of creation. In a crucial paragraph, which you can read here, if you wish, in the German original, it's a bit difficult to translate, and I'm not going to sort of comment on it in any detail. Sloterdijk describes abstract, interchangeable, and autonomous individuality as the essential neurosis of Western culture, the fantasy of an all-inclusive monadic I-Bubble, der Traum von einer all-inklusiven monadischen Ich-Kugel, which he juxtaposes with the ecstatic entanglement of subjects in a shared inner space, die ekstatische Verflechtung des Subjekts in den gemeinsamen Innenraum. The political shortcomings of Sloterdijk's approach become apparent if we read his philosophical magnum opus through the lens of Povinelli's theory of ontological subjectivity. Unlike Sloterdijk, Povinelli describes the mutual interdependence of ontological subject and genealogical society as a temporally situated manifestation of biopower. The imposition of spherical self-sameness, being bubble, for Povinelli is a historical gesture of biopolitical violence, which syncopates the flow of time and thereby constructs and expels otherness, both in relation to the past, so it creates indigeneity, and in relation to the future, it creates foreignness, the foreignness of the migrant. This gesture of violence, which Povinelli names the governance of the prior, is both constitutive to settler colonialism and structural. Through its endless repetition, the social matrix of settler colonialism achieves its hegemonic power. In other words, the violent exclusion of the other for Povinelli is both what she calls an ancestral catastrophe and a practice that must be perpetually revisited and reenacted. Without such reiteration, the bounded atmospheric interiority of the sphere either dispels or is transformed into a lifeless space of actual definitive exclosure. So you need the exchange. I'm simplifying a bit. You need the exchange, but you also constantly need to kind of sort of disavow the exchange. In her most recent book, Roots, Worlds of 2022, Povinelli expresses its idea in the following passage where she writes, you've got this here, if people were allowed to hoard their valuables, no social matrix could be fabricated out of the reflexive networks of giving and receiving. Social space would not bend back on itself and form pockets of communication and inhabitation. So this is a kind of apocalyptic message. If people were allowed to hoard, I mean, if people were actually sort of, if there was such a thing as pure hoarding, then communication and cohabitation would not exist. Instead, space would remain empty, negating any place for humans to dwell. We can think of these reflexive moments, so the pockets of communication, as the creation of a kind of imbagination of space, right? This is a neologism, and it evokes the shape of a bag, right? A flexible receptacle closed in all parts, except where it can be tied and untied. But again, this fold, or imbagination, fabricates a world in which individuals and competing worlds attempt to dwell to their advantage or disadvantage. It is important to note Povinelli's attention to temporality, where Sloterdijk writes about atemporal states of ecstatic coexistence. Povinelli reminds us that, from a diachronic perspective, no biodome ever achieves atmospheric immunity, right? We know this from actual experiments with biodomes and also from innumerous science fiction novels about biodomes. They don't work in the long run, right? A dome is only a bubble for a limited period of time between two time knots. In settler colonial societies, this process of spatiotemporal imbagination is achieved through constitutive gestures of structural violence, as we have seen. Yet Povinelli's work also points towards other different forms of imbagination that are more resonant with Chakrabarty's call for an anthropologically differentiated and affectively rich practice charged with the function of interrupting the thrust of universal, linear, and unidirectional time. Povinelli has various names for these practices. The most prominent one in her books is simply the name social project. So a social project for Povinelli is a host of interlocking concepts, materials and forces which include human and non-human agencies and which advance singular conditions under which something new is produced. I've almost reached the end of my time. In the few minutes that remain, let me draw some conclusions that relate to my own ongoing interest in 21st century Anthropocene fiction as world literature. You can see I was very careful when I wrote this, and I did time it because I didn't want to bore you. So this is really the final part. As we've seen, climate fiction and environmental apocalypse literature have long been concerned with the form of the biodome, at least since the 1970s, and with the political, aesthetic, and effective practices that it affords. Gregers Andersen's monograph, Climate Fiction and Cultural Analysis of 2020, lists the sphere as one of 4 essential chronotopes of the Anthropocenic imagination. As I hope to have shown in my lecture, this preponderance of the dome can be seen as problematic if the form is associated with atemporal stasis. Human geographer and climate activist Andreas Malm has described the human experience of the Anthropocene as a state of vertiginous temporal disorientation. He writes, "There is no synchronicity in climate change. Now, more than ever, we inhabit the diachronic, the discordant, the inchoate. History has sprung alive through a nature that has done likewise. We are only at the very early stages, but already our daily life, our psychic experience, our cultural responses, even our politics show signs of being sucked back by planetary forces into the whole of time, the present dissolving into past and future alike." In the light of this suggestive claim, our widespread fascination with the biodome appears to me symptomatic of an inability to come to terms with the radical unpredictability of life on a heating planet. Film studios and publishing houses keep us entertained with a seemingly interminable stream of near-identical narratives of catastrophe in a spirit of otherwise unperturbed entrepreneurial optimism about the future, and without any evidence that they are aware of the apparent contradictions that this entails. Cultural theorist Evan Cole Williams has described this popular and commercial interest in apocalypse as what he calls a schizophrenic obsession with civilizational collapse and mass death in a world that believes itself to be never-ending. But how can we escape this doom loop? Focusing our imaginative energies on planetary survival, we must learn to embrace alternative knowledge practices, different sensory orientations, affects, and creative strategies. This means narrating the climate and ecological emergency in new ways, not as a spectacular disaster, but as an encroaching presence that unties the knots of our comfortable spherical imaginations. The world that we inhabit today is profoundly troubling, but it rarely resembles our serialized fantasies of doom. Conventional forms of anticipation falter, and personal, shared, and intergenerational futures can no longer be easily imagined. We must be worried, but we cannot know how things will end. In this situation, it is difficult to see how the biodome might inspire new forms of world-making. The child has been seemingly absent from my talk this afternoon, but has in fact guided my thinking about form from the beginning. It is perhaps the most contested and misunderstood figuration of the self-conscious Anthropocene. Since the publication of Lee Edelman's No Future nearly 20 years ago, many scholars in the arts and humanities have written about the troubling presence of the child in discourses of heteronormative futurism, and more generally in fantasies of linear futurity. My concluding remarks will point in a different direction. Let there be no doubt, the gendered politics of heteronormativity are profoundly threatening and as dangerous, incidentally, to non-figurative children as they are to the lives and freedoms of many adults. I've got some non-figurative children at home, right? They don't always conform to the idealized vision of the child as a sort of, presence of normative futurity, I can tell you. So the complex cultural meaning of the child cannot be reduced to the context of any specific controversy, not even Edelman's empowered and politically important critique of reproductive futurism. In the text that I have discussed today, fantasies of linear futurity are not achieved through the presence of the child, but through its conspicuous absence. 2000 Ton City describes human procreation as a purely mechanical process, a doom loop of mechanically assisted fertilization and extermination, which leaves no room for intimacy, singularity, or the creation of new meaning. In Silent Running, the viewer is similarly presented with an uncanny simulacrum of Edelman's innocent child, the mechanical body of the service robot, whose self-evident cuteness does not disguise the hollowness of its only seemingly caring gestures. My research here in Heidelberg since 2022 has guided me to see the child as a figure of untimely vitality, whose appearance disrupts fantasies of bounded autonomy that are afforded by the biodome. The child's syncopated temporality, I suggest, disturbs the self-centered solipsism of the bunkerizing subject and troubles Sloterdijk's dreams of ecstatic, atemporal communion. I do not have time today to elaborate on these ideas, so let me leave you for now in the presence of an image by Ghanaian photographer Nyani Kwame, an environmental activist whose work has been discussed brilliantly by literary scholar Ian Borkham in this book, History 4 Degrees Celsius, Search for Method in the Age of the Anthropocene. If you want to read one book about this, read Ian Borkham's book. It's really interesting. The force of Kwame's image, I hope, will speak to ideas that I could not develop in this lecture. The meaning of a particular, unique life, and of its co-constitutive, unique social and political world. The meaning of a life and a world that are not contained by any realm of immunity, but fully exposed to the accumulating destructive forces of a heating planet. The meaning of a life and a world that are not bounded, but open to a future that cannot be known, and to the fate of humanity as a species, among others, in the realm of life itself. Thank you very much for listening. And over to Vera.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, for the invitation, and for this wonderful lecture. I'm really flattered and honored to act as the respondent here today. That said, I'm also a bit at a loss. How can I avoid the usual pitfalls of responses? In my experience, there are two types of response. At the one end of the scale is an absolutely sycophantic discourse, one that affirms and praises just everything that has been said before. The other hand is not only an acid critique of everything, but something even worse, a completely unrelated lecture, which shows that the respondent knows a lot more than the lecturer and should have given the lecture in the first place. Now, these responses are obviously hugely different, but they have one crucial point in common. For listeners, they are both just awful. They make you whine and cringe and want to disappear into the ground, or in terms of CAPAS, wish for apocalypse now, please. And since I wanted to prevent that, I tried to find a way between Scylla and Charybdis. And by commenting on some of Florian's points, from my perspective as a literary scholar, was formerly a historian. And among the many topics, many interesting topics, I singled out two that are interesting from my point of view. My first point concerns the significance of time and temporality. That has been remarked on with regard to Andreas Malm, but also with regard to the historian Dipesh Chakrabarti, who was quoted as criticizing the presumption of a single, homogeneous, and secular historical time. Instead, he stresses that we need to connect different time scales, combine the large temporal developments with the brief time spans that we usually work with as historians. This connection, however, is fraught with difficulties. If we want to understand different temporalities, we need to be aware of what has been called deep time and of very, very slow changes. Now, as Jérôme Bruner has shown, in everyday context, narrative is our prime means of dealing with time and change. But how can narratives raise our awareness of the slow changes involved in climate change and mass extinction? This is a tricky question because narrative evolved as a means of human cognition and human communication. It is geared towards grasping intentions and actions of humans. With regard to depicting slow geological developments, traditional techniques are more or less hopeless. What we need are creative ways of presenting time, and these are often developed in science fictions. Marco Caracciolo has convincingly argued that experiencing the presentation of slow changes in literary narratives can render readers more susceptible to invisible, entangled, slow developments. That is, novels don't have to deal with the topic of climate change in order to alert us to apocalyptic ways of thinking. Now, my second point concerns the affordances of the biodome. Florian has drawn on Caroline Levine, quoting that forms bring their limited affordances, and bounded enclosures will always exclude. The use of the form of the biodome is, of course, based on exclusion, and Florian has looked at fictional worlds as such bounded forms, as excluding and closed off. This again implies an important question. Are fictional universes divorced from reality? Are they just enclosed spaces which don't have any bearing upon real life? I would like to deny this and offer two objections to this view. First, one can regard fictional stories either as experiments in life or, even better, as thought experiments. What novelists like Jane Austen do is place a few characters in a specific surrounding and see how they relate to each other and which factors influence their behavior. It has recently been argued that such thought experiments are in a number of ways very similar to experiments run in a lab. For instance, both select and isolate, they focus on salient point, they are dependent on the experience of the scientist or novelist, and they produce knowledge. Just as experiments conducted in a lab, which are certainly divorced from reality, but nonetheless very important to our understanding of it, fictional worlds are bounded and at the same time inextricably related to life. After all, fictions present views on reality. They criticize cultural practices. They imagine alternatives. My second objection to the view that literary works are just bubbles without importance to real life is based on the idea of the biodome and literature as an interdiscourse. Even a very small world in a biodome can bring together a lot of issues that are usually treated separately in different discourses. Literature can combine ideas that have been artificially separated in academic disciplines. Even in a biodome setting with just, say, 3 or 4 characters, plus a few plants and animals, many different perspectives come to the fore. Just think of legal issues or social ones. Who has the power to decide? Which hierarchies are there? How do temporal scales clash? What about biological reproduction, and what about gender? Even works set in biodomes, very enclosed, small communities, can show how a variety of factors work together. Finally, since psychological experiments have shown that factual as well as fictional stories can change readers' beliefs and attitudes, there is good reason to believe that the biodome narrative had the cultural importance that Florian has delineated in his wonderful lecture today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.